So welcome. This is our second summer virtual Science Café. The virtual environment has given us a little push to hold Science Cafés in the summer. This is the first time we've done so, although Science Cafés have been running since 2008, when our then Dean of Science decided that it would be a really good idea for the researchers at Carleton to be presenting their work out in the community, as well as simply inviting the community to come to us when we give research presentations on campus. We started out at the Wild Oak Cafe and outgrew that space. And lately we've been outgrowing the space at the Sunnyside Library branch as well. The COVID situation has forced us online, where we can certainly expand. So welcome to everyone who has joined us online. We miss seeing all of you and meeting in real time, but we're also very excited about being able to extend Science Cafes to people who might not otherwise be able to join us in live and in real time if we weren't shutting down and avoiding get-togethers. So hopefully when all of this has passed, we can use the advantages of virtual and combine it with the live ability to interact with each other. For the Virtual Science Cafe, we'll have a presentation and we'll certainly have a question and answer session. But I would ask you to type your questions into the Q&A. You can find the box if you mouse over the bottom of the video screen, and you'll see a Q&A. If you click on that, you'll have a box where you can type questions. In the interest of time, I would ask you to limit them to questions rather than declarations or statements. Obviously, if you need to elaborate a little bit to make your question clear, that's fine. But I will be trying to hold what I pass on to the speaker to the meat of the question that I'm asked. And that way we can answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted to us. I will be reading out the questions so that our speaker just has to focus on answering them and doesn't have to shuffle back and forth from one screen to another. So what you type, I will be reading out so that everyone can hear what the question is, and then Dr. David Miller will answer them. And that is our speaker. Dr. David Miller is a professor in the chemistry department at Carleton University. He did his studies, both undergraduate and graduate, at the University of New Brunswick, and then was a NATO Science Fellow at the University of Portsmouth. Following that, he came back to Canada and was a senior scientist at Agriculture Canada, and then a visiting scholar and then full professor at Carleton University, starting originally in 1997, and then in 2001 when he was appointed to a National Science and Engineering Research Council chair at Carleton in the chemistry department. He studies toxicology and teaches and supervises graduate students in that field. He also works very much at the intersection of science and policy. So while his science is world-renowned, he's also in a great deal of demand to apply science and research-based principles to setting public policy in the field of toxicology and where toxicology touches upon public health. Today he's going to talk to us about the toxicology involved in wheat. And I'm very interested because, like many of the people he referred to in his description of this talk, I have also rediscovered the baking of bread during our shutdown and our work from home. So I will remind you to type in your questions as you think of them, although we'll address them at the end. And I will ask to our support people to turn the screen and the microphone over to Dr. David Miller.
All right, so yeah, well, thanks, Pam. I have done this a few times, as Pam knows, in real life, in the Wild Oak Cafe and in the library. I must say I'd rather be with you, but here we are today. when I was asked if I could contribute to this series this summer, for those who are online now or watch the recording later, there are things about COVID I could talk about, but it just really struck me we might be COVID out, and thought I'd bring up something that has occupied about half of my research life for the past 38 years. It's a topic um, on which enormous amounts of money are spent, enormous public health consequence, enormous cost to consumers and farmers in developing countries, enormous loss of life. But it's a topic that almost no one outside agriculture knows about. And I often say that about toxicology, the things that are really serious, we don't talk about, and this would be one of them. So it interests me, this issue, and you'll see why, that people have started to bake bread or learned discussions about sourdough starters, temporary shortages of flour, oh my God, in the grocery stores, just really amazing. And if you think about it, breaking bread and bread in its various forms all over the world, it's more than a food. It's also culture, it's also tradition. And for it's what enabled us as a species to grow and thrive, to produce cereals of various kinds. And historically, people have eaten a lot of bread or cereal-based products. In Africa to this day, about 80% of the calories of most sub-Saharan Africans comes from cereal, which is corn. And at the turn of the 20th century, average Canadians ate about 150 kilograms of bread a year, and it's about 15% of that now. But we still eat a lot of bread and cereal-based products, and that's important to this story because, for example, if there's a contaminant black pepper that you put a tiny amount of on your meal, we don't care because you can't eat enough for it to be a bother. But things that you eat a lot about, we really do care a lot about, and cereal would be one of them. So this is also a topic that is been visible since the beginning of agriculture, formal agriculture. Many tens of thousands of years ago. It wasn't that people before the advent of chemistry and instruments didn't know that there was a problem sometimes in their crops. They did know, sometimes rather visibly. So this is a painting by Peter Bruegel. It's in the Louvre. It's called The Beggars. And if you look at those poor folks, the four guys there, their lower extremities, their feet, and some are basically missing. And that's a symptom of one of the two important manifestations of ergotism. So these people are being poisoned by a fungus that damages grain. I'll show you in a picture in a couple of minutes, in a minute or two. And one of the manifestations of it is that the chemicals cause vasoconstriction in the extremities, in this case the feet. That causes necrosis, then gangrene, and then it's an axe or a saw, and usually death. And so that was very well understood. It's discussed in the Bible, in thousands of year-old Chinese writings. And it became a big problem about 700 AD in Europe, and I'll explain to you why that happened. The other, perhaps a little bit more famous manifestation, it was called in the Middle Ages St. Anthony's Fire. And in this painting, which is by Peter Bruegel the Younger, you can see a number of women are being carted off, perhaps acting a bit strangely. And those are, though in the Middle Ages, this was St. Anthony's Fire, and the chemistry involved, it's the same fungus, ergot, getting ground up and put into bread, is essentially LSD. So these people were tripping out on LSD. And I'll hasten to add that in this picture, they're mostly women, And one of the things that I'm going to share with you is some of these toxins are much more dangerous to biological males and little boys and male mice than they are to the female equivalent. In other words, females are much more tolerant, and vice versa. So it works out either way. And lest you think that that's like fanciful stuff, the last time there was a manifestation of the St. Anthony's fire form of ergotism that we know about was in 1951 in a village in France. And the miller there messed up and ended up putting ergot in the bread that was used by this town. And for those old enough to remember Life magazine, this made Life magazine. It was a big global deal in 1951. So I mentioned that this affected humans and animals, and it was quite a big nuisance for, about 1,000 years, especially in the latter part of the Middle Ages. And so it would cause villages to collapse. It would cause the farms that produce grain for the cities and the landed gentry to not be able to earn their money or even feed the population. So it was quite a big nuisance. And in the early part of the 17th century, the then Prime Minister of France, the Duke of Kousouli, he was getting a little bit tired of this because his peasants, were dying and they weren't making money for him, and his animals were dying. So he told his doctor to get on this. And he was a smart guy, and he figured out that people who got more sick if they ate more, if they had diets that were essentially exclusively grain, and if they had more diverse diets, they were richer, in other words, perhaps they didn't get sick at all. And then he sieved out those black bits that you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, and fed them to animals, and they died. And so the chemistry of what caused that wasn't known for another couple hundred years, or a little bit more than that, but they knew that if you took those black bits out, that the world would be a better place. And about 100 years later, this was heavily promoted by the state and the Catholic Church to the folks who worked on the land. And we have ergot problems in Canada, in Western Canada, quite serious ones some years, but we do exactly the same thing. The mills sieve out those black bits and we move on with our lives. So the fungus I'm mostly going to allude to is the one that matters by far the most for Canada. It's a fungus called Fusarium graminearum, and it causes a disease of wheat, which is called Fusarium head blight. And it's caused by warm, wet weather or damp weather, humid weather in mid to late July. So right about now, it's today and over the next days, and we're well into the second part of June, there's a risk that the crops in this area will end up having an infection that will be manifested mainly at harvest time in August, or a little bit later sometimes. And this compound, the fungus that causes the disease, also causes the disease in corn. The toxin involved was discovered chemically by the Japanese in 1973, but it was known for at least 100 years that grain that had this, or 200 years, that grain that had this disease could make people and animals sick. And the structure of the toxin was discovered, as I said, by a Japanese scientist from grain that had made humans sick. So again, like many other toxins that you would hear about or people talk about, this is based on compounds that really hurt people, and it was discovered that way. Therefore it could start to be measured by the middle of the 1970s. So another thread of this very important story is that the alarming human propensity to move crops around the world. So the indigenous cereal in Canada, or in North America and South America, is corn. It was the only cereal that was grown on any scale in North America, essentially the only starch crop. that was grown other than potatoes and as they moved north. And it was bred by the women who did the farming in Central America about 8,000 years ago. The ancestor of corn looks like a stunted cattail. So it looks a little like the corn that you would see in a field or sweet corn that you buy in the grocery store. It's really isn't very good. So it was selected by the women who did the farming, and then it was moved along the trading routes north and south. And in New Brunswick, where I'm from, the First Nations communities there were growing corn 5,000 years ago. So it moved all that distance very rapidly along the trading routes of our indigenous peoples in North and South America. And about 1,000 years ago, there was a pretty big crop of it grown in Ontario. The small grains that we're more familiar with, that we mostly eat, so wheat is by far the most important cereal, all come from the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where it's dry and warm, but dry. And the first cereal to move was a very primitive wheat called emmer. And again, the mothers who did the agriculture, it comes from around Turkey. They moved it north and west and east, along with the advance of human settlement into the UK. And then the next cereal to move in any quantity was barley. So the Romans liked barley and the Egyptians liked barley because it made good beer. And so thus the Roman Empire would move that out of their empire. It comes from Ethiopia. And then rye was the next one, and it moved in the 7th century, which is when they started to have ergot problems. And then notice the other cereals in Africa, teff and millet. We don't eat those crops. Teff comes from Ethiopia. It is eaten there. If you go there, I've been there, they make a really delightful flatbread, sort of a spongy flatbread out of it. But it never made it out of Africa. And then millet is, edible millet is also quite important in some countries, but still corn dominates. And then edible sorghum, we don't eat at all. It comes from around Egypt. But the other important thing is you might not associate wheat with Japan or China, but they grew wheat thousands of years ago before Marco Polo. And of course, rice moved the other way. So in Africa today, as I said, corn has become dominant, and unfortunately, it's a wildly inappropriate crop to grow there. So in the New World, then, Spanish brought cultivars first from from Spain and Portugal and so on, and into Florida, or what is now Florida, and they mostly moved south to Mexico. And South America is a major, and Mexico are major wheat areas. In the 13 colonies, and where some of my loyalist ancestors came from, they also brought wheat and barley, oats, and rye. But they learned pretty quickly they didn't grow very well. And so they, and a lot because of this disease. There's a paper in 1673 in Connecticut describing the disease that I'm talking about, Fusarium head blight. But of course, people didn't know what it was or what the fungus was or what it made, but they were aware that this could be toxic. So they mostly grew corn with some oats and some rye and some wheat, and adapted. An exception was in New France. It was a policy of the New France government to grow small grains, and so quite a large wheat crop was grown in New France. And it was a little bit colder there, so it didn't quite have the same problem. But nonetheless, there are writings from 17th century clerics talking about toxic problems with peasants getting sick from eating the wheat. So why did David Miller and many others started working on this toxin? Is something that happened when I was still way in graduate school. In 1980, the toxin was detected in a massive Fusarium epidemic all around the Great Lakes. And this resulted in essentially all of the wheat rather, in Ontario being embargoed, couldn't be used for human or animal feed. And I often say, if you don't think that makes people excited, I don't know what you think it would take. It was also a problem all around the Great Lakes in upstate New York, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois, and basically farmers were wiped out, hundreds of them. And you could say, well, we grow lots of wheat in Western Canada, and that's true, but the sort of wheat that we grow in Ontario is the soft wheat used for cookies, cakes, timmies, and so on, and isn't replaced by wheat that's grown elsewhere. And the other thing that bears mentioning now is there are 28,000 grain farmers in Ontario, so wiping their incomes out is also very, very hard, with mental strain, losing farms, and even worse than that happened to some of these farmers at that time. But even though the toxin had been discovered in 1973 and the US Department of Agriculture started working on it in 1974, there was essentially no work on it in Canada despite recommendations to do so in 1978. And a bit more importantly, we didn't know, or people didn't know, what would be a safe level. So you can't tell God to stop making these compounds, so we have to learn to live with them and really understand the hazard that they pose so that they can be safely put into our food system. So this is not an old story. There have been at least 4 epidemics in Ontario and problems since 1982 about. However, in Ontario, as I'll explain, we've become super good at managing this. In 2016, $1 billion Farmgate, meaning lost to the farmers, of durum wheat, which is dry land produced wheat to make pasta, was destroyed by this fungus and this toxin. This had literally never happened in the durum wheat areas since wheat was grown in Western North America. It was also a problem in those years in the Dakotas. And that's because the climate has changed, and I'll comment on that more. The only consequence to you, though, if you buy pasta, was that pasta costs 20% more in the year and a half following. You just didn't notice. And something like this happens almost every year in the United States and Canada, and the consequence to us is increased prices. And the last big catastrophe in Ontario was the season of 2018, 2 years ago, or not quite 2 years ago, when again about $1 billion in total of corn was wiped out by this fungus. We don't eat the corn we grow in Ontario. For the grain corn, we don't, at least not much of it. It's used for animal feed. But this is a huge economic loss to the farmers, and of course for animal producers, increased costs, and the ethanol plants. So it's not a small matter when this happens, but it's invisible to consumers. So I mentioned in my abstract that there are 4 toxins that I think are important. The Europeans would add a 5th. And I've talked quite a bit about dioxin of alum now. It was again discovered because it made humans sick. And in China, especially, fairly large numbers of people were being made acutely ill, which is vomiting, nausea, other unpleasant symptoms, and some subtle things well into the 90s. Of course, we've not had that in Canada, well, at least for a couple hundred years. The next one on my list is a toxin that isn't a problem in Canada yet. It was discovered only in 1988. It's a big problem in the United States and Africa, in China, in parts of Europe. And it was discovered only in 1988, and it was discovered from corn. It was associated with people eating corn in South Africa that had very high rates of esophageal cancer. And I mentioned it second because we wouldn't have thought that we would ever see this in Ontario in our corn crop, but in the hottest summers that we've had, the last one, 2012, we have seen some. And so there, again, I'm weaving a theme that climate is a bit of an issue here for the future. Again, this compound is a 2A carcinogen, probable human carcinogen, or it's on the way to be that. It's the most potent cancer promoter that we know. And when it was discovered, there was quite a bit of it in cornmeal you could buy on the grocery shelves in Ottawa. We just didn't know it was there, although people had known at least for a century that if animals could be made quite sick if they ate a lot of corn damaged by the fungus. In Africa, it does many worse things. And the other unpleasant thing about it is that it almost certainly causes birth defects in humans, which we found out the hard way. Zearalenone, 1965, it's estrogen, true estrogen. It was discovered because it screwed up the reproductive health of pigs. It's been recognized that if there's excess exposure, this can happen to young women as well. Again, not in Canada. We're not, but I put that third because prior to 1980, this was the toxin that was a big nuisance in Ontario, and now we almost never see it. And that's again because of climate change. So in my working life, or a bit beyond, the pattern of toxin has changed once completely, and it may change again maybe before I shuffle off this mortal coil. And the last toxin, aflatoxin, is the most potent cancer carcinogen to humans known by at least 10,000 times. It causes a third of the liver cancer on the planet. It kills children in Africa in real time in very painful ways, causes childhood stunting. It causes problems, of course, in animals. It was discovered initially because it killed 100,000 turkeys in December in England in 1962, which again, or 61. Again, if you don't think that would make people excited, I don't know what you think it would take. It was an all-out effort by the British government to solve the mystery. It is also unique among those 4 toxins in that the regulation is actually based on human data, lamentably, and not on animal data. So back to dioxin of alanol. So this is the deal with it. These are 2 pigs. They were brothers. One was fed a certain 5 parts per million of dioxin of alanol. And as I always say, you need a computer to recognize that the small one is smaller and doesn't look quite as pink and healthy as his brother. And if you ever wondered how to get pigs to take a good photograph like a squirmy baby, that's a line of molasses on the floor. And so why is this compound toxic? And the answer is it's complicated. Probably $600 million US dollars has been spent to answer that question because we can't wish it away, because it affects Canada, the European Union, the United States, China, Japan, many other very affluent countries. Mountains of money have been spent to fully understand it so that the right the right allowable levels can be set. And basically what it's regulated on is that it messes with the brain of humans and animals in a rather complicated way with 2 parts of the brain. It messes with the systems that we have to control our appetites. It's also immunosuppressant. And so then the next step in the process is that somebody has to set a number. And the soundest way that gets done, although Health Canada did it and the FDA did it in nearly real time in the 1985, as data were rapidly acquired and so much less was known. It's from a committee of the WHO and the FAO, which is called the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives and Contaminants. And this is an international committee that is you have to be a visible expert to be on it, transparency, there's conflict of interest issues up the wazoo. And this body gathers in Rome or Geneva to set limits that are for international trade. And this is very important to Canada because we are one of only 5 countries that are net exporters of food. And it's very important to our farmers that other countries don't use what are called non-tariff trade barriers to prevent our crops that we deem to be safe from entering their countries. Fortunately, with dioxin of valinol, because it's a problem for everybody, pretty much everybody agrees on what the right number is. And the key study, the critical study that is used to make this determination, despite the mountains of extra work that has been done, was in fact done in Ottawa by Health Canada in 1980. 82, 83, and published in 84. And that what that does is buy us a seat at the table. So let's go out in the field. This is a beautiful field of wheat in Ontario last summer. And the first thing we do is something that is pretty cool, and that is that I mentioned several times now that weather at this time of year is going to decide whether we're going to have a problem or not. And research done at the University of Guelph by my colleague Art Chasma, and a little bit from me, over some years developed a system which is now fully commercial. And basically what the deal is that a private company has hundreds of these little weather stations parked in farmers' fields. So you could imagine maybe we could use airport data, but you look at the map, aren't that many airports in that big area, 20,000 square kilometers. And so that doesn't give the resolution of the weather data that's needed. And so these measure temperature, rainfall, moisture, dew point, RH, and so on. And once a day they call home. You can see the little antenna there to a computer in Chatham, Ontario. And over the decades, algorithms have been developed to say, if the weather's like this for this many days, you're going to have a problem. And what that allows the farmer to do is spray a fungicide to prevent the fungus from taking off. On the other hand, if the computer says, probably there's nothing to see here this year, then the farmer can avoid spraying. And the other big benefit of it is that the government also gets this information. And so if there's going to be a risky harvest season, then it knows to ramp up sampling exercises. And notice briefly that there are a lot of the stations in Michigan. So American farmers are willing to pay for this Canadian developed system because it works better than the free one they get from the USDA. So then the farmer has got information. He or she can see the fields, and if they have a problem, they can say, well, I'll harvest this bad field or worse looking field and maybe try to get it to animal feed. If it's a good looking crop, then he or she wants to get the high value for human food, so they're going to park it in a bin. This is the bin I want to try to sell for human food. And there's some things that they can do during harvest. Then the next thing that happens is that the farmer loads up his or her wagon and drives to a country elevator like the one on the top, and they start to do some sampling and testing. But as I indicated, we make a lot of grain, and how much sampling would you need to do to be sure about that? So that in itself isn't really enough, but it's a step forward. And then by the time it gets to the flour mill, this is the one in Port Colborne, then more testing is done, but more to the point, the people who buy the flour from Robin Hood, the breakfast cereal companies, the cookie guys, the Timmy's guys, they're going to test it a lot. And they're also going to be testing while they're making the cereal in the factory, because they don't want someone like me to find a box of something on the grocery shelf and say, oh my God, and make a fuss. But they're also worried that the government will. So what the government does is only goes to the grocery store, big ones. They buy some stuff. So I'll just pick on Loblaws. So Loblaws has a big lab of its own, because although it wouldn't be their problem if there was a box of some unnamed breakfast cereal that fails the test from the CFIA, it would become their problem. So the enforcement of this and the costs of this to society are borne by farmers, by processors, and by mills, and it's enormous. Every year, it's between a few hundred million and far north of $1 billion in the United States every year are spent just to keep these things to levels that we're okay with in our food system. So in summary then, what we do, we have a problem. We can't tell God to stop making it. So we try to get the best tolerant cultivars that we can, or genotypes of corn. We try to practice the best farming we can. We use a toxin prediction system, which aids in fungicide choices and spraying. The farmers and the mills and the flour guys, they choose the lots that make the most sense for them. And then the guys making the cereals, they'll choose the best stuff that suits them, and they'll do a lot of analysis. And then finally, the government takes samples, and then they do calculations to find out, are we below the tolerable level? And that's called the margin of exposure. And I'm delighted to tell you the last time that this was done in Canada, the average Canadian is about 1/3 of the tolerable level, which is very good. In Europe, that could not be said, either for children or adults. In China, about 1/4 of the population is over the tolerable daily intake. So Canada does very well in dealing with something we just can't tell it to go away. So there's two buts about this underway. So we've been trying to make cultivars and genotypes more resistant, and this has been annoying the fungus. So about 10 years ago, the USDA discovered that the fungus is saying, fine, I'll make something else if you don't like vomitoxin. And so a population was discovered in Minnesota that makes something else altogether. And in fact, it is more toxic than vomitoxin. So a big global interest now in the OECD and in the USDA and in the FAO is that the fungi that we've come to know and love that make toxins are actually saying, fine, I'll do something different. See how you like that. And then the second thing I've alluded to, this is a report that was issued by the FAO about 4 months ago, I think now, and the chapter on climate change makes the sobering point, especially for someone like me who spent 38 years working on it, that the problem is getting worse all over the world because of climate change, and therefore we have to be very aggressive about keeping on top of these changes and monitoring. So I just have 2 more things to say. In my longer bio, it makes clear that I've spent a lot of time worrying about this in developing countries. And this is a picture of 2 little boys that I took in a village in Benin, in very rural Benin, and about 20 years ago, or 25 years ago. And I have spent a big part of my life worrying about those 2 boys metaphorically. Now you can see one of the little boys has got a bowl, or at least I'll tell you it's a bowl. And in that bowl is corn porridge, the dominant crop. That bowl, it was literally full of aflatoxin and fumonisin, the most dangerous combination of toxins you could imagine. Statistically, those 2 little boys would have been dead if I'd have come back to the village 6 months later. If a farmer in the United States had fed his or her cows or pigs corn contaminated like that, they'd go to jail. And yet this is a really quite a large problem. And so there's upwards of 500 million to 750 million people that are exposed, mainly in Africa, but also parts of Latin America and East Asia, at orders of magnitude above these extremely dangerous toxins. And kids die. They get cancer, of course. They are stunted, which is worse than it sounds, perhaps, and they die. So the last comment is, in 2006, it's not uncommon for pet food to be contaminated, and this causes, of course, a large fuss. You kill somebody's dog or cat and you're in trouble. And at least 3 pet food companies, to my knowledge, since the middle of the 90s, have gone bankrupt because they've made a mistake. Often this is like organic-y, pet food that is involved. And so this is a headline that was in the English-speaking newspapers all over the world, including the Ottawa Citizen, in January of 2006. And the story is that dog's really sick, and the owners of the dog call their employers, tell lies, and race to Cornell University with their credit card to try to save the dog. As I said, this was in every English-speaking world newspaper all over the world. In the same year, somewhere up to 1,000 children in Kenya died of the same thing, which didn't make the news. And so with that, the important bottom line messages are the invisible to you, but the agri-food system is working flat out to keep these things out of our food system. It's not so happy in developing countries. And unfortunately, we're coping with changes that come from climate and genetic factors that require ongoing vigilance. Anyway, so with that, thanks for listening, Pam.
Thank you. We already have some questions that have been posted. I think you touched on the first one, but I'm certainly going to read it because it's a good question and it maybe give you a chance to recap. It says, is genetic modification a viable option to increase plant resistance to these toxins? If so, what could the benefits and the consequences be?
Yeah, so I can give you a very good answer to that. Essentially, most corn in North America is Bt corn, which makes it more resistant corn and more resistant to insects. But it turns out that where fumonisin is a problem, the toxin fumonisin and aflatoxin, recently it was shown that when the Bt protein is present, it also lowers the concentrations of fumonisin and aflatoxin. And for many years, the assumption was that the economic benefit of Bt was primarily to the farmer and to the companies that make the genotypes. But an analysis by a clever economist who did her PhD on this, who's a professor at Michigan State now, actually showed that the presence of the Bt gene saved American consumers about, in today's dollars, about $500 million a year because it ensured a better supply of milled corn. So essentially the WHO and even, God bless them, the Europeans acknowledge that this is an example where there's a prodigious benefit, both in terms of reducing pesticide use, but in terms of eliminating some of these toxins. That said, we don't use genetic engineering in wheat or the small grains, and so that really is off the table for that. And there's no other example other than the adventitious issue of insect tolerance in corn helps lower the two toxins I mentioned, aflatoxin, fumonisin, which don't occur in Canada.
And you touched on it in the context of genetically modifieds, but someone has asked you more generally, how would you compare the Canadian food safety regulations to those of the United States and Europe?
Okay, so the United States and Canada, essentially, as you would expect, would have identical rules. They're not expressed the same way, but their intent is identical, and that's because we trade commodities across the border. But more to the point, I mentioned in when I was talking about the International Committee that that we agree with the international guidance that comes from the Joint Expert Committee on Food, Hazards, and Contaminants. Now, thank you for the question because it allows me to explain another complexity. What the WHO committee and the joint committee I mentioned that I've served on does is actually decide how much is safe per kilogram body weight. It doesn't set a number for what's allowed in the crop or in flour, for example. And the reason for that is that people eat different amounts of wheat or corn in different countries. So Canadians and Americans eat rather a lot more corn in our diets from milled corn than Europeans, very much more. So it would matter much more to us if there was a problem in corn, and we would want to adjust our regulations accordingly. In Europe, they eat less corn, so they act accordingly. It happens, though, that the European rules for the toxin I mostly talked about, dioxin, are somewhat stricter. An important reason for that is, though, they eat more bread from wheat than we do, not that we fundamentally disagree. So Canada and the United States are homogenous. Our diets are really rather similar, and we agree with the toxicity and the appropriate regulation. And we have, I should say, since 1985. It's a little bit stricter now than it was in 1985, but because we know a lot.
Okay, and also related
And
to that.
I want to add one more thing. I will tell you, though, that the Food Inspection Agency and Health Canada do a fair amount more surveillance than our American cousins do.
That peripherally touches on the next question, which is, should we be concerned about governments quietly changing the tolerable levels of these toxins due to deregulation? In your experience, is this likely?
No. And I've given you two reasons. Firstly, you can't do something like that quietly. That's a major change, and it would have to go through the public process. A second important reason I've given in my talk, and that is that whatever the regulation is, if you're making a breakfast cereal or Timmy's or cookies or whatever, or bread, you don't want to meet the government regulation. You want to greatly exceed it. And there are lots of technical reasons why you would make that choice. But basically, the people selling you products have and do, except in the most extreme circumstances, far exceed what the government requires of them. Again, because they don't want someone like me to go and buy something and get in the news, even if it's bullshit, if you see what I mean. And then the third reason is that I've tried to say that for grain exporting countries, there's an enormous self-interest. There's only 5 of us normally in making sure that we do have harmony. And so the idea of Canada making a change of consequence would mess up our relationships internationally. The United States would close their border in a heartbeat to commodities, which would be a very bad day. It'd like make aluminum look like, nothing. So absolutely not. And this is a pretty transparent process. And as I've tried to say, there are lots of forces at work to produce the safest food that we can afford, basically.
Another question, if corn is contaminated, does fermentation change the effect of these toxins in any way? In some cultures, corn is fermented as part of the preparation process.
Yeah, good question. So that allows me to introduce another thing before I directly answer. So I mentioned that corn is, of course, the indigenous cereal. And for those of you who've been in Mexico or go to a Mexican restaurant, whatever, or South America, the corn would normally look like a tortilla. And so about 5,000 years ago, a smart entrepreneur in Guatemala developed a pot that you could boil water in, a ceramic pot that you could heat water up enough to at least bring it to a boil. That turned out to be a really good thing. So those who are familiar with the chemistry of soap know that women would take ash from the fire, extract the lye out of it, and then use that to convert some of the lard from the cooking into soap. Right, Pam? And saponify it. And so right from early earliest times, the women who were making corn porridge in Guatemala and South America learned that, the mothers learned that if they put some of that wood ash extract, which is lye basically, into the pot with the cornmeal, the children liked the taste of their corn bread better. So that's how tortilla making emerged. And the entrepreneurs moved that technology all over Latin America for, it took about 1,000 years, all the way up to into the United States, where tortillas making was important. But, and up until the 1940s, the thinking was that that made the corn bread tastier and made it more nutritious for protein reasons. But it turns out that it also destroys the toxin. So although the corn is every bit as susceptible in North America as at these dangerous toxins as in Africa, at least in the warm areas in some years, indigenous peoples figured out, or women figured out, how to get rid of it. So on to the question of the fermentation. In Africa, especially in West Africa, countries like Ghana, for example, where this is fermenting corn porridge basically is a thing. The impact is not large, and there is it is some reduction, and of course it does improve the nutrition of the product a bit better, which is beneficial. But basically it isn't really all that important in reducing the exposure. And there's quite a bit of idea that, well, we'll just get the folks in sub-Saharan Africa to make tortillas, but they don't like tortillas. And more importantly, you need access to a lot of water to make the tortillas. I mean, a lot of water to wash the lye out and the crap out of it. And that just isn't there. Good question, though.
And we also have, David, do we have the science capacity to stay on top of these toxins, or is that in decline, i.e. closer to the absence of expertise prior to your arrival on the scene?
Yeah. Well, it's in the United States, I would say it remains quite solid. And in fact, Congress requires, allocates a line item in the American budget that Congress writes in, because farmers ask for it, to require that research be done on this topic. And furthermore, Congress requires that any American professor or government scientist who gets money must go to a meeting once a year to find out what everybody is doing, so that they're not wasting the taxpayers' money. And so the Americans are still very important at generating R&D. In Canada, it would be dishonest if I said the capacity remains at the level it probably needs to be in view of climate change. And I say that only because the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, said in 5 years ago that they were very fearful about the genetic change issue. And I mentioned that 3 months ago or 4 months ago, the FAO indicated that internationally we are very fearful about the impact of climate change. But I'm confident that these questions are being examined by agriculture, especially in Ontario at the present time. And you know, that's something that policymakers are going to have to consider. It is important, I think, to reflect that for the idea we're coping with COVID now, that God will not smile on us this year and give us a good crop throughout. You can't count on that. And indeed, because it's warm and humid now in parts of Ontario, you know, there's a little reason to be concerned that there'll be some part of the crop that will be at risk.
Okay, and finally, since we have a moment or two more, I'm going to tuck in a question that I touched on when we were doing a little bit of a dry run of the technology a couple of days ago. How do these toxins affect the product when grains are used for beer making rather than for bread making?
Yeah. Um, so it's a problem. So beer companies, for decades, they have wicked high standards for barley and wheat that they buy for beer. Better than the cereal companies selling child's breakfast cereal. And there are two reasons for it. One of them is that they don't want somebody to analyze the beer and find some toxin. Um, but that isn't really the reason. The important reason is that it had been known for hundreds of years that grain that was damaged with this fungus, Fusarium head blight, made bad beer. It causes something called gushing, and what that means, and you still occasionally see it. I have friends who are in America who are craft beer, or their husbands are connoisseurs, who report buying sort of, you know, small label bottle beer from people and then opening it up and then it just gushes out and you haven't shaken it or anything. And that's caused because the fungus is changing the proteins and some special chemicals that are in natural chemicals that are good for you in wheat that essentially cause the beer to screw up. So it's a matter of some considerable moment, way before it was a moment for public health, to be concerned in Germany and Scandinavia about buying the best barley because they knew it would cause gushing in the beer before we cared too much about the toxins.
Okay, well I believe we have one more question that has come in since I slipped mine in, and we don't have any time, but I'm going to put it in anyway because I think it's an excellent question and a great way to wind up. How can citizens in the developed world advocate for better regulations and safety frameworks regarding these areas in the developing world?
Yeah, well, it isn't really about regulation. It's about ability to produce food that is safe. So for example, this year in Kenya, the grain the government put in stores to deal with famine areas is all too dangerous to use. So you can have all the rules you like, but if you can't produce the crop that is able to feed your people. And so you could see in one of my slides a committee of the International Agency for Research on Cancer that I chaired. And one of the strongest recommendations that we made, it was co-sponsored by the Gates Foundation, was that we needed to do more work to diversify the diets in developing countries. And I've also indicated that in pre-colonization or pre-colonial, invasion of Africa, the food system was actually better at dealing with these toxins than it became because of the introduction of peanuts and corn, which were introduced in 1575 and a little bit later for peanuts, but were not promoted until about the 1960s for various reasons. And so this is an example where the food system changed in a direction that has proven to be quite harmful. And a lot of people worry about this. So it isn't about advocating for regulation. They have regulations. It's about capacity to produce food that is meets, that is tolerable at best.
Okay, well, I will wrap things up there and thank David very much for this fascinating talk, and thank everyone for attending. The Faculty of Science has a newsletter and a mailing list. I would encourage you to go back to the same place that you signed up to join this seminar. And if you haven't already done so, to sign up for the official Carleton Faculty of Science mailing list, which will tell you about future science cafes. We certainly have some more interesting ones planned. I don't have all of the dates yet, but those are being firmed up as we speak. And I hope to see everyone who was here at our future summer virtual Science Cafe series. And thank you all for joining us here. And once again, thank you very much, David.